Okay, Desiree, are we ready to go?
We are ready. I've got your recording started.
Fantastic, thank you. So I'm going to go ahead and call this work session on Assembly Continuing Education to order. Let's go ahead and start with the roll call of Assembly members.
Yes, Mr. Chair. Ms. Allard?
Here.
Mr. Constant?
Here.
Mr. Dunbar?
Here.
Ms. Kennedy?
Here.
Ms. LaFrance?
Here.
Mr. Perez-Verdilla?
Here.
Mr. Peterson?
Present.
Ms. Davidson? Mr. Rivera?
Present, and Ms. Quinn-Davidson is excused.
Okay. Mr. Weddleton?
Here.
And Ms. Alatel?
Here.
Perfect. You have quorum, Mr. Chair.
Great, thank you. All right, so normal for Assembly members, feel free to get in the queue via the chat, but any substantive discussions should be held on the record vocally. So we have two topics for today's continuing education. We're going to start with ACEs training being led by the Anchorage Health Department. I'm very excited for this. And then the second hour is going to be the Anchorage Equal Rights Commission, and we're going to be joined by Mitzi Anderson. So I will go ahead and turn it over to our wonderful health department.
So I am just having a little moment of technical difficulty. So while I'm figuring out how to share this in a PDF form, I'm wondering, we have 4 folks today from the health department that are not from the health department, but associated with the health department that are going to be available either as presenters or to answer questions. And I wanted to check, is Trevor Stores online?
Yes, I am.
Perfect. So we have Dr. Parrish, Trevor Stores, Christy Lawton, and myself. So before we get started and I get this put up, Dr. Parrish, do you want to introduce yourself first?
Sure. I'm Jared Parrish. I'm the Senior Maternal Child Health Epidemiologist at the Alaska Division of Public Health. I've spent a good amount of time focusing on studying from a public health perspective the effects of child maltreatment, child abuse and neglect on the health outcomes of children and families, and have done some work with adverse child experiences and looking at that as a more contextual environment. And so I'm happy to be a part of this and can be available for questions, and also be visiting with you guys again next week, I think.
Wonderful, thank you. And then Trevor, would you like to introduce yourself?
Good afternoon, everybody. Trevor Stores. I'm the President and CEO of the Alaska Children's Trust. The Children's Trust primary mission is the prevention of child abuse and neglect. We have been around for over 30 years doing this work, and specifically are leading the Alaska Resiliency Initiative, which is a statewide work around not just ACEs, but toxic stress and building of resilience. Very versed in the topic, and looking forward to answering your questions and sharing some insight today.
And then Christy, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Good afternoon. I'm Christy Lawton. I'm the Public Health Division Manager here at the Health Department, overseeing our community health nursing, WIC, and environmental health services programs.
And then everybody, I'm Natasha Pineda. I'm the director here at the Health Department. So can everyone see this screen?
Yeah, yes.
I couldn't get it to run like a normal PowerPoint, so I'm sorry for the Adobe version. So hopefully you got, I think you got 2 attachments, or maybe 3. We did send over the Anchorage Health Department's recommendations on the use of the prevention funds for the proposed tax. And it is a multi-page document. It is something that I actually intended Christy, myself, and Sarah Richardson, who was a fellow with the health department, but we were able to bring her on a small contract to help us wrap up this recommendation. We had planned on giving it to you in February prior to the actual election, the voting, but we got waylaid by the coronavirus. So we were able to wrap it up and send it over to you guys. It contains a lot of the information that we'll also walk through today. But we did want to make sure to share that with you since we had done the work. And then there's also this PowerPoint, should have been in your attachments. And then there may have been another attachment sent to you on the Health Equity Index, which was the MOA work, some research that Dr. Parrish shared with us. So we're not reviewing that today. I believe next week he'll be able to do some information during the Health Policy Committee, but he is here to answer questions and is a great resource that we have within our state. So those are the materials that we'll be reviewing. Our plan is to just do a basic overview of what our adverse childhood experience is. What can we do as a municipality to address them in our community? What is the Anchorage Health Department doing, and why invest in prevention? And I'm going to do a little bit of the background, but I'm also going to ask Trevor to share some work. I have worked in ACEs, and so had, I think, Christy, in our previous lives, but I have been out of the direct work around ACEs for a couple of years, working more in operations and healthcare policy. So Trevor has been doing local and statewide work and brings that lens, and we'll be able to share that with all of you. So I'm going to start out first with a slide on just the data. We gave you a lot of links and a lot of information, recognizing that we're not going to get through all of that today, and you're not necessarily going to read all of it, but some things that wanted to just put your attention to is your ACE score. If you've never done your ACE score, it's an interesting exercise to go through to see what your score is and how you can kind of match up with our statewide numbers. The Alaska Resilience website is a great website. It was not in the data links for the last presentation. There is a link to the economic costs of ACEs and really all of the different data sources that we pulled from. So I just want to make sure you guys all have access to that right up front. So I'll just get started unless you guys have any questions. Essentially, ACEs are potentially traumatic events that occur in a childhood that's between 0 and 17 years that can lead to chronic physical and mental health problems, mental illness, substance misuse, early death, and a multitude of other negative health and social outcomes in adulthood. And, this is one of the things I think that Trevor will talk a little bit about is that adverse childhood experience, the study itself was a really large scale study that was done, I think about 15 some odd years ago. And as all studies do, you have to kind of limit your study subject matter. So just because these are the 10 adverse childhood experiences that they studied doesn't mean that there aren't quite a few other adverse childhood experiences or traumas that can really shape how people's lives go and how their health proceeds during their life. So I'll let him talk a little bit more about that. But I wanted to just run through what the ACEs are from the actual study. So the CDC itself actually estimates that around 61% of American adults have experienced at least one ACE, and about 16% have experienced 4 or more. Later on in this presentation, we'll talk a little bit about our Alaska and Anchorage data, but those includes everything from emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, mother treated violently, substance misuse in your household, mental illness in your household, parental separation or divorce, incarceration of a household member, emotional neglect, and physical neglect. Those are the basis of that study. They are associated with a wide range of negative outcomes. And in the paper we gave you on the policy recommendation on page 4, it lists out some of those negative outcomes. Bottom line is that there are significant findings that the greater the number of ACEs, the greater the risk for an array of, poor outcomes. I'm going to hand it over to Trevor. I know you're probably called in, but you can't see the slides. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay, so I just have up on a slide deck so that you can kind of just speak freely. There's a triangle and it kind of shows like generational and historical trauma and goes all the way up to early death and kind of talks about the conception of ACEs through their life cycle. That is up on the screen, but feel free to just kind of jump in and give your background and the things that you wanted to share with the Assembly about ACEs.
Absolutely. As Natasha was alluding to, the ACEs was a study, and it's focused in on 10 specific, highly toxic, stressful environments or situations. but it doesn't capture all adversity. Really, ACE's study was bringing forward the impact of toxic stress. And it's important to note that there are different types of stress. There's actually positive stress that we all experience, and it's okay. Then there is just your general negative stress, which could be just that stress of a deadline or just not being as successful, maybe not winning a game, those kind of more singular one-time things, whereas toxic stress is when you're continually impacted by the environment or the situation. So i.e. child abuse and neglect, continually coming home with the continual threat of potentially being abused or not having access to being neglected through not being fed or having contact through the parents and so forth. And it's a continuous stressor, and it's very toxic because you can only deal with it for so long before it really starts impacting both your physical, social, and behavioral life. And what's really important that I wanted to share was when we talk about adverse childhood experiences, think of the C to the power of 3. It's really adversity to the childhood, the culture, and to community. So when high levels of trauma occurs, but currently we're all experiencing on the community level how COVID is impacting us across the nation, but also specifically within our own communities. It creates an ongoing stress. And we're starting to see, and we'll see more of that kind of impact on families, whether we're talking about rise in incidences of child abuse and neglect or domestic violence, but also just overall in the mental health of both the children and parents. When we talk cultural, that's really capturing the intergenerational aspect. If we think about our Alaska history, the impacts that we have had, Western culture, on our brothers and sisters of the Alaskan Native community, with residential schools, or when religion was brought into the community, that kind of impact, that historical impact. It's not just with Alaska Native. If we look at any of our minority groups like African American, Pacific Islanders, Asian communities, that historical trauma and how it then translates into who we are today has great impact. And again, has a connection to many of the physical, social, and behavioral ills that our communities are dealing with. So when Natasha is going through this information, it's less about the score. If I did my ACEs score, it would come out as a 0 based off of that study. However, when you start looking at the 3 C's, both childhood, cultural, as well as community, my ACE score would greatly change, and it would no longer be a 0, and many of us would be in the same boat. So as you're going through this, be less about the study and looking for the answers, and more look at this of understanding it about being philosophy. As we become, as the community, more trauma-informed, we are better able and equipped to address the issues and get to the root of the issues and allow us to implement not only programs, but systems and policies that are supportive to our children and our families and community as a whole as we move forward. So that's all I want.
Oh, I think we lost Trevor. Well, thank you, Trevor. I appreciate that, being able to bring that perspective. And yeah, I think it's really important to remember that this is a study that was done that really gave us a lot of information that we can use to inform how we do our work and how we think about community systems change and prevention, and how we create a healthier community, that community that has less homelessness, a community that has less people negatively impacted by high-risk behaviors or infectious diseases that are entirely preventable. And so I'm going to talk a little bit now about data, which I know is there data about this? People want to know. Obviously, there was this really large study done in California, and then there has been actually a lot of research and work done in Alaska over the last 5-6 years. I'm not going to go into every bit of the data, but I want to talk about four main sources of information that we do have. And then of course we have Jared on the line who can talk, answer questions. I'm not going to go through every single slide that I provided for you because you have it and you can review it. I want to make sure we have time for questions. But I did want to talk about, there's four different buckets of data we wanted to share with you. There's the Healthy Alaskans data, and really Healthy Alaskans, if you're not aware of it, there's a Healthy Alaskans 2020, and then there's already, the planning is almost finished for Healthy Alaskans targets for 2030, and our department helps participate in that. Essentially, it's a state health improvement plan that helps drive data and decision making around health indicators. There's 25 health indicators for Healthy 2020 that were selected throughout the state, and then those are used and hopefully infused at the community level as appropriate. So some of the data that we were able to get from there, I know that Anchorage data is really important to all of us. It's important to me. We as a health department don't have a data infrastructure or epidemiologists or really databases at all, so we rely heavily on our state partners. So one of the delays of this was we were trying to get some of the updated data for Anchorage. So you'll see this throughout the slides. I'm really using this as an opportunity to educate you about these slides. So when you're reading them, you can understand. So there is updated data, let's say in this first column around suicide and mortality rate per 100,000 in Anchorage. There is 2018 data, but we had a request in and they were working on it, but the COVID-19 really just really put everybody's energy in different areas. So when we get the updated information for these ones that are either marked 2015 or not as recent, they'll get updated as we can. Bottom line is, I think it's really clear to see if you look as you read these tables, whether you're reading them here in this PowerPoint or you're reading them in the recommendation we gave you, you can see that for the first indicator around suicide mortality rate, our baseline in 2010 was at 28.5 per 100,000 in our community, and it actually is at 41.8 in 2015. So we're learning a lot about our community by looking at the data. One of the things that we weren't doing a lot at the health department prior to having Sarah, who did a lot of research for us, was we didn't have a lot of the data pared down for Anchorage. So that's enough about that. I just wanted you to see that we do have these ACE related indicators, so you can look through here and see where Anchorage is. The column that you want to look at is that third column. So the middle column is our Anchorage current, the most current data that we have available. So you can see that 36% of students in Anchorage had reported feeling sad or hopeless every day for 2 weeks or more in a row, and that stopped them from doing some usual activities during the past 12 months. And that's an indicator that we would want to have. We would like to have less than 1 out of every 3 kids feeling that way in our community, or at least I would. So lots of data here. They come from multiple different sources. They come from the BRFSS, which I'll explain in a moment, and the YRBS. So really the scorecard helps us understand.
Ms. Pineda, actually, before you go on, I have a question from Mr. Weddleton.
Oh, thanks. That I think on a couple of these, I looked at that email that you sent earlier, and on the Healthy Alaskan goals, it surprised me how high some of those are. In particular, that first one with suicide mortality. And the question there, I thought all suicide would be mortal, but that seems very high for a goal. How do they set those goals? I mean, it's depressing to see that as a goal.
I think that the target, the Healthy Alaskans 2020 target, is based on statewide. There wasn't, I don't think there was an Anchorage-based target when they established it. What would be great is if we had the resources for the 2030 to do local targets. So that Healthy Alaskans 2020 target, and I don't know, Jared might know more about it than I do, but I'm pretty sure that was set on a statewide number, and that the statewide rate, we have historically been one of the highest, unfortunately, one of the states that has the highest rates of suicide mortality for youth and I believe adults. And so I believe our statewide rate is higher. So our local rate was lower than the statewide rate, right? And when that was set in 2010, but then over time, it looks like ours changed. So that's a concerning area that we should be aware of.
I think on most of these, I mean, your goal should be 0, right? So that may not be realistic. So are these targets, I guess target, I should say, is 0. Are they more like, given the resources we have, we think we can reach this?
Yeah,
Or,
so what
how
happens?
do they come up with those?
Yeah, so what happens is there's, and Jared, jump in if you want to correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah,
So oh, go ahead.
If you want me to, those targets are made by committee, and they use all available information that they have at the time. And what they take into account is the complexity of the information and the amount of information they have. So exactly what you mentioned is, what are the current resources, what are the resources we've been directing towards this problem, as well as how has this trend been behaving over the past decade. If the trend has been behaving in a flat or increasing level, making a projection forward using some basic statistics plus reason information and our resources directed towards it are generally how those are set. And each Healthy Alaskan goal has a different committee. Sometimes there's overlap, but that's how those are set, and they're set based on what is reasonable based on our investment, based on the complexity of this, and what the information historically has been showing us and what our trajectory is.
Okay, that helps a lot. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So
Well,
John,
no, it's still sad, but I understand it more.
it's really sad. And I've been working in Alaska for 20 years in prevention, early youth development, and historically our investments as a state around early childhood prevention, adolescent intervention have been grossly inadequate to the size of the problem, which is why I'm so passionate about maintaining as much as we possibly can investment in prevention. I put up here a chart that shows, so if you actually go to the Healthy Alaskans 2020 website, you can click on, it's a great website, you can click on the, let's say you want to learn more about that suicide one, you would click on it and it would pop up a chart that looks similar to this. It shows what our goal is, what the US rate is, and then what really happened over time. And it's updated pretty regularly, but again, even Healthy Alaskans 2020 is underfunded and I think got a lot of funding cut recently. So our access to some of this information will change over time because of how our state investments are made, or whether federal funding for those things continues. So just to keep in mind, like, that's a really great place to go. The thing that the Healthy Alaskans did, which was really nice, is they came up with an Anchorage scorecard. So I can send that to you, but then that's where we got a lot of this information from, is from that scorecard. So they put together the data for the localities. I think they made some for a variety of different communities around the state, and we're able to use that. But we never sat and said, hey, in 2030, Anchorage has these rates, we want it to be this. That might be an exercise that we as a community may opt to want to do. Of course, it requires some resources to coordinate, but it also focuses energy around these local data measures that I think are often overlooked, and people just don't realize how many of our kids are dying here. I know next week you guys will have some presentations from providers who are doing early intervention and treatment, and I know of many of them lose kids on a regular basis to suicide who are trying to get through a treatment program. So we lose kids in Anchorage unnecessarily on a regular basis. So another data source is the BRFSS. That is called the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System. So a lot of the measures you saw that you might see around adult information is going to come from this behavioral risk factor surveillance system. The state of Alaska does participate in this program, and we do get enough respondents to be able to have data related to it. So I shared that with you in the report. And again, I won't go through all of them, but I thought this slide's great because it gives you a sense of a snapshot of in 2015, how many adults in Anchorage reported having experienced any of these things before the age of 18. And you could see where we compare to the state and to the nation. So we definitely have a lot of people in Anchorage, in the municipality of Anchorage, reporting that they are growing up with mental illness in their household, more than the state, more than the country. You have a lot of alcohol misuse, you know, obviously divorce and those other kinds of things that are impacting our population. So I'm just sharing that as a brief overview. You can research it more if it's an area of interest to you. The YRBS is the Youth Risk Behavioral Survey. Sorry, I didn't spell that out. That is a national effort that's run by the CDC as well, the Center for Disease Control Prevention. And Alaska students do take part in it. I think it's every other year, and they have lots of rich information and data that allows us to have a better understanding of what's going on with youth in our state and our community. It is anonymous, voluntary, and requires written parental consent. This gives you just a little sense of I think this is the latest one. Actually, there's probably one in 2019. It's just not, the data is probably not available yet. It does take a little while to put together, but it gives you a sense of what's happening in our Anchorage school district versus the aggregate of what's happening across Alaska and the country. And again, some areas where, you know, we just clearly have a lot of kids growing up here that are feeling alone or disconnected. So you have 22, a little, you know, it looks like we're the same as the state. But that just feels too high to me. The SAD and hopelessness indicators are concerning. And then we also share in the written recommendation. And
sorry, Anita, I have a question from Ms. Allard.
Sure.
Thank you, Chair. The reason I'm asking a question about, I don't know. Okay, so we have a lot of military here. Do our numbers include military families or military members that are not necessarily Alaskan residents, and then we get federal dollars if they commit suicide, unfortunately, here in the state of Alaska?
That's a good question. Jared, do you know right off the top of your head? I would assume if their students go to the school district, are enrolled in the school district, and they opt in to participate in the survey, then yes, their responses would be included in the YRBS for sure. But I'm not sure I know the answer to that, so we can find out.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Hold on, I'm just going to write that down. Okay, thanks. So I'll get speedy here because I want Christy to be able to talk about what we are doing and then move on. But I wanted you guys to get a sense of what's going on with our maltreatment. And I think next week, Jared will be able to show you guys some maps and show you the layering over of where we have high rates of child maltreatment and health inequities that might be negatively impacting our population, or we're pretty positive they're negatively impacting our population. So we definitely have a lot of alleged maltreatment in Anchorage. This kind of gives you a sense of the age groups by category. I'm not going to dive into it too deeply, but I just want you guys to start seeing and understanding these numbers and how a lot of these numbers, they start here, and they're young, and we could prevent or intervene early with these, not just this population of kids that are represented here, but other kids maybe that aren't reported, and that would really decrease the negative outcomes I think we see on a daily basis in our community if we really put some resource and effort towards it locally. In Anchorage in 2018, there was 1,687 kids out of home placement. And that makes up 41% of the whole state's population of kids that are in out of home placement. So then we're going to talk a little bit about how to prevent and address ACEs. I did talk about this a little bit with you guys last week, so I won't spend too much time on it, or 2 weeks ago, but it's really important when you're building a prevention funding program. We've learned a lot over the last 40 years really of investment in prevention and youth development.
Sorry, Ms. Pineda.
Oh, go
I
ahead.
have a question from Ms. Zolotel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As we proceed with our different interventions and our conversations around them, it would be really good to get a sense of timeline in terms of when we can expect to see those outcomes that Ms. Pineda, that you mentioned, because I think that's a big piece of prevention, is educating the public about the, I don't know, expected timeline for return on investment. So,
The 20-year timeline. Thank you.
yeah, or if it varies from program to program,
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
that education piece is just really paramount as we have these discussions. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for that feedback. So over the last 30 years, really, there's been a lot of, I think, finite improvement around the work in prevention itself. And there has been a real move away from doing funding that's focused on just one issue, but really looking at root causes and trying to address broadly the conditions in your community that may be contributing to negative outcomes for youth and families and individuals who live within those communities. So as you're moving forward and thinking about how you want to work around ACEs, we are recommending that you build and expand on the efforts to prevent and reduce the impact of ACEs through building resiliency. We really hope that we can have data informed or evidence informed interventions that are largely either adapted from or inspired by the Centers for Disease Control or the federal DHSS prevention frameworks. I've shared those with you, and I think they're really important. We have spent, I think, decades building how to use evidence-based or informed programs to the best of our ability. That being said, I think there's some really specific areas that you can focus on if there's, I think, really limited resources. And Jared and I have had conversations about that, and I'd be interested for him to share that with you either today or next week. So really, again, just back to looking at ways that we can intervene to lessen harm and prevent future risk, but also make sure we intervene before harm occurs. So creating opportunities for strengthening economic supports to families, changing social norms, and providing skill development and coping mechanisms. I won't go into these because I'm going to hand it over to Christy because we're going to really run out of time, but these are all in those reports and I'm happy to talk about them anytime. There's a whole science around prevention and investing in prevention, and we are here to support you in that effort. So I'm going to hand it over to Christy now, and Christy, just let me know when you want to change slides.
All right, perfect. So we've been doing a lot of exciting work at the health department over the last year after receiving a, oh, you're starting there, substance misuse. Did you?
Where do you want me to be?
Oh, I thought we were starting on this training specific. I'm sorry.
Okay, I'll do that. That's fine.
Okay. So last year we applied for a grant from the Alaska Children's Trust and received essentially $10,000 that we really looked at aligning to help us with efforts to build a foundation with our workforce so that everybody here really understood, at least at a basic level to start, why it was important to understand adverse childhood experiences. What does being trauma-informed mean, and what does it look like to try to create a trauma-informed organization, as well as looking at embedding some of the protective factors from the Strengthening Families framework. So we chose to focus on kind of 3 primary protective factors that we are looking to try to embed, really because, as you guys all know, we are serving a lot of at-risk and vulnerable populations within the health department, everywhere from in our community health nursing clinic to WIC, to child care licensing, and the folks that we serve at the Aging and Disability Resource Center. They're all people that we want to have the opportunity to use every connection that we have and every engagement in a way that we can figure out how we can help them build resiliency, help them connect to resources, and really see us as a supportive resource. You could move to the next slide. So components of the project, a lot of it was focused on training because there hadn't been a lot of department-wide training or really any department-wide training on these topics. We had a few staff from various programs that had had the opportunity to do some of the training before, but we really wanted our staff as a whole, which included everybody from nurses to, environmental health, sanitarian, food inspectors to our front desk. We wanted everybody to have this information really so that whoever comes in the front door and whoever's greeting them, whether it's on the phone or at our front counter, they would have this information to be better equipped to support and provide the best possible customer service. So this past winter, we did a lot of staff training with the first round of a really high level overview of ACEs, trauma-informed care, and strengthening families. We had 3 training sessions. We passed our goal of training 95%. We did have a few that we missed, but it was really well received. Staff were very engaged, and those conversations have continued within the programs. Our other goal was really looking at how do we continue to make our AHD a welcoming place, which is definitely one of our priorities. And how do we make sure that we aren't potentially causing any additional trauma for those that come here, that coming to a governmental agency for service puts them in a vulnerable position. And these are folks that have typically a lot of complex, social, emotional, economic issues going on, complex health issues. So really kind of trying to evaluate, how do we do that? What are the improvements that we can make? So that's kind of being done within each individual program slowly over time. Then really it's looking at how do we embed the knowledge, because we didn't want to just do training and, be done, kind of put that information on the shelf, so to speak. We really want to, and have challenged our supervisors to figure out how do they embed that into policies, into just ongoing day-to-day conversations with staff, to continue to increase their knowledge. And build on what we've learned. So that's also ongoing. And then I think, as I already said, really just looking at the trauma-informed lens, which also includes, which we've done, we haven't entirely completed, but some programs have taken some additional initiative and are further along, looking at just even how we set up our lobbies and how, when folks come in to access services, what does the environment look like? How do we make it welcoming and non-threatening and safe? So those are some of the things we've been working on. Next slide. In addition to the ACEs, trauma-informed care, strengthening families training this past winter, we did just also complete 3 rounds of training on historical trauma and resiliency. This ended up being delivered via video. We had plans to do a really interesting activity. It's called the blanket exercise in person with our staff in April, but obviously that didn't work. So our trainers through the Alaska Child Welfare Training Academy pivoted, and we put together a wonderful webinar really going over kind of the historical context here in Alaska for our Indigenous peoples, and trying to bring that framework into focus for folks that maybe are not familiar. And really, how does that change, or how should that change how we think about working with people, not just Alaska Native, but people of all sorts of backgrounds that have a different lived experience and have, generational trauma in various different ways that, it changes how they bring themselves into their lives, how they might show up in our workspace, and how they present to us. And as we continue to go forward, our goal is really just to continue the conversation, to try to have these topics on our agenda whenever we meet, so that we can continue to build on those foundations we've created, and to just really deepen the work and evolve as we go forward. I think that's about it, Natasha.
Thanks, Christy. I'm going to come back up here and just plug the substance misuse assessment. So in 2018, for those of you who are here, we completed the first ever substance misuse assessment for the municipality of Anchorage. And one of the policy recommendations in that was related to ensuring training on trauma and cultural competency for municipal employees. And then, so we took that on and did it at AHD. So I just wanted to let you guys know we're still moving forward with all those recommendations that we put into the substance misuse assessment, and looking at integrating this into our department was a part of that. So why invest in addressing ACEs? I'll just spend a couple minutes here, and I can talk a little bit about what Meg was getting to, really, like the benefits of addressing ACEs or doing prevention in general as a community and investing in prevention, which we really don't do at the municipality and haven't traditionally historically, is really to achieve a healthier and safer community overall for families, individuals, for children. And those outcomes for prevention, I've been doing this for so long time, and it's sometimes it's hard to sell prevention because people are looking for an immediate, shiny opportunity to see an immediate outcome. But oftentimes when you're investing in improving health or intervening in a child's life to give them better coping mechanisms and skills, you see those outcomes later on in their early adulthood and later adulthood. And you see those outcomes in, whether or not you have high rates of homelessness or untreated mental illness or, economically failing families that are unable to achieve accessing supports through the system. So the outcomes are often in the health of your community, and you don't get an immediate bang for your buck. There's a lot of research and studies, and I'll be pulling it together because Austin and Suzanne asked me to, around kind of the return on your investment. What's the return on your investment for every dollar invested? Usually you save $7, total down the line in costs to the community. In particular, for Alaska, there has been a recent study on the economic costs or impacts of the ACEs that were identified in that study in Alaska, which is pretty significant costs total to our communities. And so if you think about, this is Alaska, we didn't do one for Anchorage because we don't have resources to do that, but you could take a stab at identifying what those costs would be for Alaska, for Anchorage. So we really think that addressing and preventing ACEs is going to lead to a healthier and safer community in the long run, and a stronger economy. And that is it. I don't know, Trevor, do you have any wrap-up comments of things that we did not hit on that you think would be important? Or Jared?
No, I'm good.
No, that was a nice overview, Natasha, of the concept of adverse childhood experiences, and happy to entertain any questions if they are relevant to data or what the state's been doing as well.
Great. Thank you all for your presentations and providing your expertise on this subject. Do we have any questions from Assembly members? Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you all for your presentation today. This has been really helpful. I appreciate the work that you've been doing in these areas. And I was wondering if Dr. Parrish, Ms. Pineda, if you could talk a little bit more about the coordination between the local efforts at the municipal level and at the state level from someone outside of this area. It's really hard to tell who's doing what and who has authority to do what and how you work that all out. So as far as how you do that, if you could speak to that, I'd appreciate it. Thanks.
I can start. So essentially, the state grants us authority to do certain things in the health realm through funding resources, right? So or by statute. So like childcare licensing, they provide us with a pass-through grant to do that, but they also provide us with delegated authority to implement that work in our community. And so we have a couple of areas where we receive funding for that. We don't actually have any, well, number one, I think maternal child health funding is like grossly underfunded, but I could be wrong. Dr. Parrish can comment on that. We don't have any initiatives that come through the municipality that I am aware of related to prevention, early intervention in these areas. Oftentimes it comes through grants from the state to local nonprofits and organizations, and that funding is usually passed through either from the federal government or maybe a small GF allotment that is used with that federal funding. Is that accurate, Jared?
Yeah, that is. I think the person who can best speak to this would be Rebecca Morrissey, who is the section chief of Women's, Children's, and Family Health and has her pulse on all of the programmatic activities and that overlap between the state and any of the communities that we're trying to serve. One of the areas that I think is important for us to look at too is the home visiting programs. There is federal money that comes to the state for home visiting that the state does do, and then also partners with like Providence, and so there's families that are being served that would be living and residing here in Anchorage municipality, as well as coming in from other places as well. There's home visiting programs in other communities as well. I think South Central Foundation has one that's going on, and so there's a lot of partnerships that are coordinated on specific activities. And I know there's been efforts to try to coordinate efforts as far as all early childhood, and a lot of groups are starting to form around that. The All Alaska Pediatric Partnership has been doing a lot of work about taking a scan of what are people doing and where are those overlaps. And so I think that we're still trying to peel back the onion because people are trying to deal with what little resources they have and get as much impact as they can through partnerships. So that's really what I can speak to right now, but Becky could speak to a lot more on the specifics.
And from the department level, we don't have like some formal financial relationship with the state to do any of that work or are involved in any of those partnerships. But through our relationships, so Christy's relationship, my relationship with Trevor and Dr. Parrish, we were able to get, put in a request and get local information about child maltreatment produced and made for us through those. Really, it's kind of a relationship-based a situation at this point. What I think is really exciting about the funding that's available through the alcohol tax is putting some institutionalized dollars from the municipality to help leverage the efforts that are happening, the small buckets of resources that do exist to have a positive impact on our community members.
Thank you. And Mr. Chair, may I follow up?
Go ahead.
Ms. Pineda, you talked about metrics and outcomes and how difficult it is to measure the efficacy of programs and interventions, or it's a much earlier investment, clearly that takes much longer. Is there any research in terms of like children in a certain age who go through specific kinds of ACEs intervention successfully reduce their ACEs score? I mean, it seems too, you would also, oh, you're smiling. There must be something good there. It seems like you would have to also, have the child be outside of that environment for one, which requires other sets of resources. But anyway, if you guys could talk a little bit more about that, it'd be great. Thanks.
Who wants to go?
Natasha, can I help with that question?
Absolutely.
So on the larger scale, in the sense of prevention, like child abuse and neglect, our numbers that we experienced today didn't happen immediately. So if you think of a traumatic experience like your faucet bursting open, the water starting to flow, you can quickly turn it off and resolve that immediate issue. Child abuse and neglect doesn't happen overnight. It's taken us decades to be where we are because of a variety of factors, which I won't go into. So to think that you will implement the program and in a year have some dramatic change when it's taken us 40 decades to where we are doesn't compute. So it will take time. However, with evidence-based programs, they have been studied and they know the effectiveness and the impact. And we are able to show through short-term, medium, and then long-term analysis as well as goals of that impact. It just won't have this dramatic change like going from 3,000 substantiated cases down to 500 in a year. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Another piece with an ACE score is you don't change an ACE score. once you've experienced a traumatic experience, it doesn't go away. COVID-19 will not go away for any of us. What does change is how we address that and what resources and supports do we provide so the trauma no longer becomes or is minimized as being a barrier to the development of that child and not being a reason for the variety of challenges. So, i.e., there are tons of programs, and again, it's very large. So when a child is, we know through protective factors that when we connect, for example, a child to 2 to 3 caring, loving adults outside of their natural support system, and studies show, and it was shown here actually through some work at the university using the YRBS data, that the risk of experiencing any of the physical, social, behavioral ills that trauma can lead to is greatly reduced. So it can vary depending on the topic, and that's why we use a trauma-informed approach. When you use that philosophy, integrate it into the program, you have greater success. Jared or Natasha, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, Natasha, can I add a little bit?
Of course.
Great. And I'm sorry, I don't know what assembly member asked that question, but thank you for that question. That is very pertinent and very directed, that timing matters with a lot of this too. And we think about our trajectories and a life course perspective, that when we intervene on these things does have an impact as well. And we think about our experiences, there is a lot of research that clearly documents that if we intervene on these combinations of factors, it will have an anticipated outcome. But there's also research that we have right here in Alaska that I'm going to be sharing with you on Tuesday that clearly shows that if we improve the household before a kid ever enters it, we have evidence that shows that they'll have less contact with our child welfare and a lower ACE score at age 3. So we have clear documentation that what we're talking about is actually improving the unit where that child is experiencing its growth and development. And that way we can relax and hopefully reduce the amount of system influences that are needed to support and respond to the impacts of it. And so when we think about prevention, prevention occurs along a continuum. It actually should be considered as an investment. If you prevent, you have to still do your response. You still have to do those other things. And you actually probably might have to do those a little bit more at the beginning of it, because once you infuse prevention, you end up identifying things you might not have identified before. And so if you invest early, even pre-birth before a kid's there, you're really thinking about improving that environment where that rearing is occurring. And so I'll share with you guys some really neat data that we have coming out that I've really enjoyed looking at and sharing with people.
Thanks. And then I just add one, like, I guess, concrete response for you, Ms. LaFrance. In 2008, I started working at the state on underage drinking. And I believe the state, prior to me getting there, had just come out with their very first concerted funding and statewide plan on decreasing underage drinking. And if you look at over the last 10 years, 15 years, in fact, they have reduced youth-reported binge drinking from around 25% down to under 15%. And that's a significant, but it's over a long period of time. So that kind of shows you, like, that's a concerted effort where you have Recover Alaska, you had a statewide plan, you had multiple funding sources and streams like infused into that very specific issue, and that over time they were able to address it in multiple different populations. And so there's actual data to show that, looking back, what that investment actually resulted in. So I think there's kind of multiple ways to answer your question.
Thank you all so much, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I think we might have time for maybe a couple more questions if folks have any before we return to the next segment.
I'm just showing the screen, Chair Rivera, just to show Suzanne the chart itself. It shows the blue line going down over time. A lot of times with prevention, it's a look back. Okay.
All right, I'm not seeing any other questions. Thank you again. Ms. Pineda, and everyone else for presenting today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
So this second presenter that we have for continuing education today is Mitzi Anderson with the Anchorage Equal Rights Commission.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. I haven't, my Teams meetings so far have just been with staff, and it's just been a couple little squares. So this is my first large one. Would it be helpful if I share my screen with slides, or do you guys have the slides in front of you?
I would go ahead and share the slides, please.
Sure. Sorry, 1 second. Okay, how's that?
Yes, we can see it.
Great. Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, I've only done these on a smaller scale, so I just want to make sure we're all technologically on the same page. So thank you for your patience, and thank you for having me today. I appreciate your time, and I appreciate the opportunity to share a little bit about what's going on with the AERC and what we're up to. I haven't had the opportunity to meet many of you yet, so I did want to just briefly introduce myself. My name is Mitzi Bolaños Anderson. I've been with AERC now about 6 months. I get to work with a bright and dedicated staff, and it's been a really wonderful experience so far. We are a small office. We're 6 employees, and I think being such a small office, it's really important that we all have a really productive dynamic and are able to work well together, and we do. So I think that has been great. I came from the Alaska State Commission for Human Rights from Asher, and I was an attorney and mediator for them before this position. And so I bring a lot of that experience with me here, and it's really great to be able to compare, two agencies that are so similar, be able to compare our procedures and just different ways that we go about certain things. I'm originally from Miami. I've been in Alaska about 6 years now. I started off as an AmeriCorps Vista here in Alaska with First Alaskans Institute. And then I clerked and did a few other things in between. My family is from Cuba, and Spanish is my first language, so I really appreciate living in a city where my culture is appreciated and celebrated, and that is really exciting that even in Alaska, I can still go to so many places and hear people speaking Spanish and celebrating the culture, so that's been great. So I wanted to go over a few things. I prepared a really brief presentation, leaving time for lots of questions. And so I wanted to go over our new strategic plan, some of our 2019 statistics, briefly chat about some of the legal issues that AERC faced last year that I know you're all familiar with, and some of our Title V recommended updates. With us, we also have Megan Carmichael from the Municipal Attorney's Office, and she has been great, and she's worked really hard with the AERC. She and her team have worked really hard with the AERC to work on those Title V recommendations, and so she's with us in case there's any questions that I might not be able to give as in-depth of an answer as she might. So she is available to us. Thank you very much, Megan. So with that, we can jump into some of the changes in our strategic plan. And they're very minor, it's a word here and there, but I think it's really indicative of the direction that I want to take the agency. And so the first thing is adding prevent here to our goals. So eliminate and prevent discriminatory practices. And so, yes, we are an enforcement agency, and we're not going to go soft on enforcement, that's for sure. But I think it's really important to really be a resource in the community. So beyond being just an enforcement agency, I want to, help prevent these instances from happening in the first place. So along those lines, we have partnered with the Alaska Small Business Development Group, and we have now planned a series of workshops with them, and also we hope to turn them into videos to help small businesses with some of these legal issues that they face. And so what we see a lot of times is a small business who doesn't have an employment counsel down the hall or even an HR department, and they want to do the right thing. Many times they just don't know what law applies to them or how to implement that law. So we want to make sure that we're a resource in the community and that we are helping these companies. Most of our cases are employment, and we'll go into that. So that's why I keep referring to companies. We want to make sure that these small businesses in our community understand that we're here also as a resource for them. And along those lines, so with the small business partnership, Asher has also been involved with us, so the State Human Rights Commission, and that leads us to the next change, is this collaborative attitude. Asher and AERC, although we have very similar goals, we haven't partnered very much at all in the past. We did a long time ago, but in the last 10 or 15 years we haven't. And so I think with new leadership in both organizations, I think it's a great opportunity for us to really join forces. And of course there are differences between us. We have different protected classes, different jurisdictional limits, but our overarching goal is the same. And I think being able to partner and network and join forces in that respect is helpful for the state as a whole, not just Anchorage. And so the last change is this really focusing on fairness and impartiality. I think it's so important. Anchorage in so many ways is a small town, is a small community, and our reputation and our credibility, I think, is paramount to the work that we do. And so really making sure, a lot of times people assume that we represent complainants when that's not true. So making sure that both potential complainants and potential respondents understand that we are an impartial agency. We are here to share information. So yes, we do investigate complaints, but we're also here to share information and to make sure that individuals know their rights and that potential respondents know their responsibilities. So really, I think honing in on this, we are impartial. And that goes also for municipal employees. So we have jurisdiction for municipal employees, and being able to rely on that reputation of impartiality, and knowing that, even though we are also part of the municipality, that does not mean, that we have any bias in any way. So I think that's really important in our community for everyone to know that we really are impartial. And then jumping into our 2019 stats. And so you all will receive our annual report within the next couple of weeks. And I apologize that it is so late this year. Our March commission meeting was canceled, and that's usually when the commission votes on all the approvals for the annual report. So it wasn't voted on until our May meeting, and so it has delayed our report. But this is from the report, and so this is a little preview for you all until you receive the full thing. So our inquiries were pretty much in line with previous years, a little over 500 inquiries. And an inquiry is just a phone call, an email, a walk-in. Sometimes it's just a pretty simple question. Sometimes it's wanting to file a complaint. And then the question is, well, is this jurisdictional to us? And so of those 500 inquiries, we found that 130 of those were jurisdictional complaints, and the person did want to proceed with the complaint. Sometimes it is jurisdictional and the person says, well, let me sleep on it. I don't know if I really want to do this. But for the most part, they will come in and sign their complaints. So it's about 25% new complaint rate based on our inquiries, which is in line with previous years and also industry-wide. The next area, or the next statistical chart is area. And so you'll see that by far, the majority of our cases are employment-based. We do get a handful of housing and public accommodation and government practices complaints, but financing and educational institutions, we don't get many of those. And you know why? I think we can make some guesses. You know, is it because these things aren't happening there? I don't know. But I know that this is one of the jurisdictional differences between us and Asher, and I don't know if it's an education, more of an educational aspect of making sure that people know that we do have jurisdiction over all of these areas. So that's something that we will definitely look into and see what's going on there. The next chart is our bases. And so you'll see also that disability is the basis on which we receive most of our complaints. And many complaints will have more than one basis. And so that's why these numbers won't add up to the total number of complaints, because we'll usually, for instance, retaliation is usually added on to a complaint, a different complaint of an underlying discriminatory allegation. Sex does include pregnancy and parenthood under the Title V definition. So those are all lumped together. We could pull a report if we were interested in seeing. So this includes sexual harassment is the bulk of that 28. But we could pull a report to see how many of those. It's just a handful of the pregnancy and the parenthood that fall under that. And then you'll see going down, our numbers are pretty low for sexual orientation, gender identity, and marital status. Next, we have our closures. And so NSC determination, that's our non-substantial evidence determination. That is about half of our cases are closed as NSC. And that standard is pretty low. It is a low bar. It's I think, unique to administrative agencies. And it's just below preponderance. So preponderance is more likely than not, and substantial evidence can actually read you the actual definition if you're interested, but it's sufficient evidence that a reasonable person would find adequate. So it uses adequate instead of likely. So again, a pretty low bar, but it is still difficult to meet. You know, we still need to have some kind of evidence to support the allegation. So you'll see about half of our cases are closed, non-substantial evidence. And that's not to say that it didn't happen. It's just that we could not find the evidence to support it through our investigation. About a quarter will be settled, and these settlements are three-party settlements. They are the AERC with complainant and respondent. So the AERC does seek public policy relief in these settlements, and that means a review of their anti-discrimination policies, requiring training for employees and for management, and also putting up the AERC posters in the workplace. And so then we have withdrawal without benefits. And so this is just someone who comes in and says, I just don't want to do this anymore. I just don't want to proceed with this. In that case, if we see a public policy concern, or if the investigation is far enough where we think there is something going on there, the executive director is able to step into the shoes of complainant and file a director's charge on behalf of that complainant, even though they want to withdraw. And we'll actually talk about that in a little bit when we go into Title V. Withdrawal with benefits is usually a private settlement. So it's a settlement between the parties, and they did not want AERC involved for whatever reason. we usually try to stay involved as much as possible, but sometimes these private settlements do happen. CPA requests right to sue letter. And so those are for cases that are co-filed with the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So we do have a work share agreement with them. And as long as it is jurisdictional to them, which is 15 or more employees, a couple other aspects there, it will be co-filed. And so we investigate the complaint, but there's a parallel case with the EEOC that goes with it. And then at the end of the case, the EEOC will generally adopt our determination or our closure, however it is that we dispose of the case. So sometimes someone says, a complainant will say, I have an attorney now, and I don't want to wait for your investigation. I just want to go ahead and go to court. Or they'll say, I want a type of relief that the commission cannot give me. So the commission is limited to make whole relief. So if someone is seeking something like pain and suffering or punitive damages, the commission can't do that. And so they would proceed in court. So they would request this right to sue letter from the EEOC in order to do so. And there's a time limit on that, 180 days before they can receive that. Administrative decision, there's a section in Title V that lists, I think it's 8 or 9 different times that a case can be administratively closed. Oftentimes, most of those 5 cases would be a complainant who, disconnected their phone number, the address is returned to sender, we can't find them to interview them, so we end up closing the case. So it's more often than not a complainant who is not cooperative or who has disappeared and we're unable to reach. Conciliation is when we have a substantial evidence determination. So we did find sufficient evidence that a reasonable person would think is adequate to support this allegation. And then it moves into the conciliation phase where, again, it's a 3-party settlement where the commission seeks both make whole relief for the complainant and then also public policy relief. Like I mentioned, policy change, training, AERC posters. And make whole relief for the complainant is intended to put the complainant back in a position had the discriminatory act never happened to them. And so that oftentimes includes lost wages. And complainants do have a duty to mitigate their damage. So we do tell them throughout the investigation to document that they have been, oftentimes there's a termination involved. So document that, they are seeking comparable employment, keep track of your applications and such. So we seek make whole relief, oftentimes lost wages. It could also be something like the cost of healthcare or other benefits that were lost due to the termination or whatever the adverse action was. And so again, those are three-party agreements. And one of the changes that we'll talk about when we get to the Title V slide is in relation to these 3-party conciliation agreements and is allowing us to do 2-party agreements. So what happens sometimes is that complainant says, well, this make whole relief isn't enough for me. I want all of these additional damages, usually pain and suffering type damages, which we cannot provide. And so in those instances, we have to close the case administratively. So that would fall in that category right above there. And so one of the Title V categories for administrative closure is that complainant refuses to accept a reasonable settlement offer. But then in those instances, it's closed and the AERC is left without the opportunity to seek the public policy relief that we want. And so one of our suggested edits or one of our suggested recommendations would be to allow for those 2-party conciliation agreements in instances where complainant refuses to cooperate. And then complainant, again, in that instance, would get a right to sue letter and would be able to pursue the damages that they seek in the court system. And then no jurisdiction, only one. And, ideally, we wouldn't have these no jurisdiction closures. Ideally, when we get a complaint in, we wouldn't take it in if it's non-jurisdictional. Sometimes they get through and we don't realize that it's non-jurisdictional until later, or it's a mistake. Where I've seen this come up a lot of times is in the Native organization context. So we do keep a list of organizations that we know for sure are non-jurisdictional. And so I guess on the spectrum, on one end, we have tribes who are, 100% sovereign immunity. We don't have jurisdiction there. But then there's a little bit of a gray area with related companies, related organizations, and how closely tied are they to the tribe so as to, share that sovereign immunity with them. And so some of those are questionable, and sometimes we might take a case in and later realize that they are too closely tied, and they are not jurisdictional. That's just one example. There could be others, and that's actually a good segue to the next slide, talking a little bit about this litigation that went on last year. And Megan, I'll ask you to chime in if I miss anything. But I know you're all familiar with this. And so in this case, a little bit about the procedural posture that I think is important. So this case didn't, it didn't go to trial, and we didn't get a judgment in that sense. So this was an order for a preliminary injunction that basically found that Hope Center was likely to succeed on its contention that the public accommodation portion of Title V did not apply to homeless shelters. And the way the court got there was that homeless shelters are explicitly exempt from 020, which is our housing provision. And so just in statutory interpretation theory, you don't want conflicting provisions of a statute. So you want to read a statute in a way that it creates this harmonious whole. And so the court found that, or the court noted that if public accommodation was meant to include homeless shelters, then that exemption protecting homeless shelters in 020 would basically have no effect. So it did find that Hope Center was likely to succeed on that public accommodations did not include homeless shelters. And so that leads us to our Title V recommendations. And I don't have exact language to share, and that's because these recommendations are still in front of the AERC and still in front of the commissioners. They have not yet voted on which recommendations, if all or any, they wish to recommend to the Assembly. And so what I've done is kind of put these categories together of edits that both the legal department and I think would be helpful moving forward. And so now it's up to the commission to review these, and they may have additional suggestions, or they may not like some of these suggestions. And so I don't know what their resolution will look like once that is shared with the Assembly. But to give a general idea, these are the areas that we are looking at. So updating definitions, both for gender identity and public accommodation. Public accommodation, we're adding just a phrase in there that says if they accept public funds. And so that would have been very helpful, I think, in the litigation last year. And then the gender identity definition, I don't think there's anything wrong with it that we need to fix per se. I think it's just when this definition was written, the current definition was written, it was several years ago, and I think it has evolved since then. So looking at the Equality Act, the Federal Equality Act, and also looking at HUD's definition, just working on that language a little bit. Removing 525, which is the housing provision. So Title V has its own housing provision, and that's 520.020. And then we have this Chapter 25 there, that from my understanding, and I'm not completely clear on the history behind this, and I can find that out and share that if there's interest. But from my understanding, we at one time pursued a work share agreement similar to the one we have with the EEOC, but with HUD. And in order to be considered for the HUD work share agreement, we needed to have this language in our code. As far as I know, that agreement was never finalized, and we didn't end up having a work share with HUD, but this stayed in our code. And here is where we found the exception that the court relied upon in the Hope case. So removing this chapter because it's not used, and also, we have our own housing provision already in Title V, so this was somewhat redundant. One of the major differences, and I think is also can also help prevent some of the issues that we saw last year in the future, is better defining the relationship between the commission and the executive director, having the commission exercise some more general supervision over the ED. And part of that is right now, I think I explained a little while ago about how if a complainant withdraws, the ED can step in their shoes and file a director's charge. The ED can also, under code, initiate a general investigation if it is aware of something going on within a company or even an industry. And the ED right now can just do that on her own. And so some of these changes would provide for commission approval before a director's charge or a general investigation is initiated. So providing a little bit of a check and balance there for the ED. And our staff, we're only 6 people. We don't have a staff attorney. I'm the ED is kind of ED/staff attorney. So I don't have that legal sounding board within my office. The legal department for the municipality has been wonderful and has been, very helpful with questions. And I know I can call up there if I have a legal question. Those oftentimes they may be conflicted out since we do have jurisdiction over the municipality as well. The next category of changes is our 240-day timeline. And so all we've done there is say except for good cause. And the reason we did that was because the 240 days is not often, but is frequently, we don't frequently meet the 240 days. And that could be for a variety of reasons. Oftentimes it's a respondent who is just not providing the evidence, or, we have to continually request evidence. We do have subpoena power, which is helpful to keep within our timeline. But we do try to keep investigations informal without having to resort to that if possible. And so, once we have attorneys involved, especially if there's attorneys on both sides, sometimes there are settlement discussions going on that we may or may not know about. And so that also extends the timeline. So it's helpful for us to have this, good cause exception for the 240 days. The confidentiality provisions have also been looked at a little bit. Just some minor changes there, basically focusing on disclosure to the public instead of kind of relaxing a little bit internally. And then finally, some procedural, more of a cleanup, I think, to the reconsideration, conciliation, and hearing sections. A lot of those are, again, procedural, maybe timelines. I think one of the big ones, like I explained earlier, allowing for 2-party conciliations, I think would go a long way for the AERC to be able to seek that that public policy relief that sometimes we're left without being able to do if our complainant is not cooperating. And so that is all I have for my presentation, but I am more than happy to answer any questions. And again, if there's something specific about last year's litigation or something more specific about Title V that I'm unable to answer, I will ask Megan to chime in, or I will happily, do some research and make sure I get that answer to you as soon as possible.
Great. Thank you so much, Mitzi, and I'm really looking forward to seeing the annual report. Any questions from Assembly members? All right, I'm not seeing any questions right now, which definitely is not a sign, a negative sign. I would say we have meeting fatigue. It's been quite a week. But I really do appreciate your presentation and looking forward to seeing some of the recommendations that come from the commission. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. And again, thank you all of you for your time and for your interest in our small agency. We are quasi-independent because of our somewhat judicial nature, but it is always great to keep in contact with the Assembly, and I really appreciate your time. And again, if any questions do come up, please reach out, and I will definitely get that annual report to you within the next couple weeks.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And with that, we don't have any other topics for this work session, so I'll go ahead and close this work session. Everyone go take a walk, and then we will be back at 2:10.